we would like to start with the second part of this event. So if everyone who would still like to join this discussion could make their way into here, that would be very helpful. So in this second part, we're shifting the focus a bit from open government data to data that is shared by businesses with other businesses amongst each other. So we're talking about sharing and reusing data in a B2B context. And later on, we're also going to talk about another issue, the B2G context. But let's first start with this type of data that is mostly machine generated or anonymized and can be shared in an industrial context, in farming, in IoT, in telecommunications. And we have somebody from AUDI here, so also in the context of the connected car. There's different ways of sharing data in such contexts. There's the open data model, but of course it can also be done in exchange for other data or in exchange for money. So in order to encourage businesses to share more data amongst each other, the Commission has recently proposed some guidelines and some principles instead of a regulation. So we won't be talking about a regulation here in order to encourage this type of data sharing. On this panel, we have Heiko Richter. He's a research fellow at the Max-Planck-Institut for Innovation and Competition in Munich, also a PhD candidate at the Free University of Berlin. He works at the intersection of competition law, copyright law, and information regulation. He's also a published author on different aspects of regulation of the data-driven economy. He's recently published a book about the Information weiter Verwendungsgesetz, which Malte has already made a joke about. So that's basically the law transposing the PSI directive into national law. And thank you for already making that joke. I would have done that otherwise. There's Peter Wells. Welcome. He's head of policy at the Open Data Institute. To those of you who are not familiar maybe with the Open Data Institute, it's an NGO headquartered in London, which was founded in 2012 by World Wide Web founder, inventor Tim Berners-Lee and AI expert Nigel Shadbolt. And the goal is to bring open data thinking into society, companies, and governments. Is that approximately correct? Okay. Before that, he advised the UK Labour Party on digital policy, worked on open address registers in the UK, and worked in the telecoms sector. Thank you. Malte needs no introduction. You've already been on the previous panel. He's a data bureaucrat. So he says on his Twitter bio.
It's my self-description indeed, yeah.
Thank you for joining us, Felix Schwabe. He's head of data and mobility business at AUDI and responsible for the development of the company's database services. He also used to work in the connected, so he's an expert on both the connected car, but because he worked also at the plant management at the AUDI plant in Ingolstadt, he can also maybe say something about IoT connected factory context. And then lastly, we have Jakob Greiner. He is Senior Manager European Affairs at Deutsche Telekom in Brussels, responsible for data and privacy policy there. He's a lawyer, and he previously worked for Apple as a legal counsel, I believe, and as an advisor for a CSU member of the European Parliament. Welcome, Jakob. So, in order to set the context right here, I wanted to ask Felix and Jakob to tell us a little bit about what kind of data sharing your companies are already engaged in and how that works. Jakob, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you, and thanks for the invitation. maybe I start quickly with a little story or a conversation that I had in Brussels maybe two and a half years ago. Somebody from the institutions, and they said, look, Deutsche Telekom has such valuable data, and why don't you just open up the whole data to everybody? You know, we have all these startups in Europe, and their problem is they don't have enough data, and they could just, you know, take the data from Deutsche Telekom, make something very valuable out of it, and Deutsche Telekom can then buy the startups, and by that you boost the European data economy. And I think for me that was a bit the starting point of a discussion that took place in Brussels quite a while about how to boost the data economy, and maybe we come later to whether this story that I just told you is the right solution. If you ask me what we are doing in terms of data sharing, I'd like to not talk about how we cooperate with other companies, which we of course also do on a contractual basis, but we also have just recently launched a neutral platform or data market, a marketplace, as it is called now, where we are basically the intermediary. We are not really actively taking part in the data sharing, but we provide the possibility to one company to open up its data either to everybody on this data market or maybe just a selected few other companies. They then make contracts with those companies. And to give you an example, think especially about, for example, the logistics sector. You could imagine there's a logistic company that maybe then finds a cooperation partner in terms of a harbor, or maybe a company that provides weather data. And by bringing those together on this platform, those companies might end up having a much better improved route for the shipments, etc., etc. So we see this as one solution, surely not the only one, but one solution how to incentivize more sharing of data between businesses to take place.
Thank you. Felix?
Okay, yes, thank you. At first, thanks for the nice introduction, and I want to explain a little bit what we think about GDPR and so on. But Lina asked me in the break that I can, if I can get some examples how we think about data. And I work, as she introduced me, over 10 years in the production. So I want to give you also a short overview how we start in the production. It was around 2008, and what is today really normal about open data and big data, it was completely new for us. So we don't know what we can do with our data in the production. We have a lot of data, we call it big data, but we don't know what we can do with that. So that was the biggest challenge what we have. And then we start with hackathons and so on. So what today is really normal, and every company do that. And we find some specific cases, use cases, what are really interesting. So for example, we start in cooperation with KUKA, knows the robots, the orange robots, and they are really interested in the data, and we have a lot. So they can really focus and bring us a good forecast when the robot needs new items and such on it, so like maintenance. So that save a lot of time and also fall down time, and that's the important thing what you have to do in the production, that the production line is still running and efficiency running. Another good example is the quick check-in, what we have with our suppliers. So in the old case, the trucks from the suppliers comes and they need a long time to check in into the plant, and we in Ingolstadt are the biggest plant, so we talk about 700 or 800 trucks per day, and it's a lost waste time when we have to wait for the trucks. So we can quick check in like we do it every day in the airport. They can check in when they start at the supplier home, and it saves a lot of time. So just these both examples from the production. now I shift since 4 months in the business for connected car, and now I'm not a lawyer like the other guys here. I'm more interested in business, to make business, digital business, and that you have to imagine what we talk about is the digital business at Audi has 4 huge fields. So it's connected data, connected mobility, connected car, and my Audi. And we think that we have the most potential at data. So, for example, also some use cases. I think when we talk about insurances, that you as a car driver get a better rate because you're a safe driver. You don't drive a lot in the night, and you are really easy and calm with the gas and so on. So you can get a better rate, and you don't pay 900 euros per year. You can have a good driver's behavior, and then you paid just 200 euros. So that's one use case. The other use case, for example, is road condition, road maintenance. So cities and the government spent a lot of money for road conditioning and controlled it, and we have a lot of cars. So when we watch about VW concern, we talk about millions of cars at the roads, and we can do it with our sensors. So and that's data who we can share easy to a bigger audience.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Felix. Malte, you're a lawyer, but you're also working, or you worked on these principles and guidelines that the Commission proposed for this kind of data sharing that Jakob and Felix have just talked about. So maybe can you tell us something about the idea behind this, why you've decided not to regulate this sort of data sharing yet, and what kind of development you would like to see from the regulator's point of view?
No, great pleasure, and thanks for the opportunity to do so, because it's an interesting piece of work, and it's actually, if you read the principles, it's as close probably as you could get to legal drafting as you can in a document. But the story starts earlier, and it starts with the German commissioner, so Günther Oettinger, who went into the public sphere without asking for a lot of advice, but following probably some sort of instinct or maybe some insights he received directly from industrial players. And he was saying, if data is really the infrastructural item for the new economy, it's the new oil, what does our legal system say about that? How do we capture the value that is embodied in the data? So it's value embodied in data. The data themselves have probably no value, but it's the value that you can extract by processing the information in the data. In the examples that we just heard, there's efficiency gains. There's a lot of things that, and I'll get to that. So he was basically saying, yeah, well, in the classical civil law systems, we had property rights and we have contract law rules, and that's the BGB, the Bürgerliche Gesetzbuch, basically should receive an update. And that he went public into this, probably more testing the public opinion. But at some point, the work landed on my desk and another desk to say, okay, now you make it happen. Now, there's lots of reasons not to get to a civil code anymore, because it's very, very complicated to assess what it will actually mean. But jumping now fast forward to 2018, to one of the popular historians, I always have to check his name, is Yuval Noah Harari, the 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, 21 Lektionen für das 21. Jahrhundert. Somewhere on the first third of this, he says, well, the question who controls, he says actually who owns the data, but I think he's meaning to say who controls data will control part of our future. So there's a fundamental of the question of our times that lawyers and politicians and maybe even poets, he says, should address. How do we manage data as an asset in the society and the economy? And if we don't address that question well, we'll be overwhelmed by a lot of things that we're not seeing happen. He's basically linking it to the manipulative power of data, but then obviously if you expand it a little bit, there's going to be a lot of disruption from robotization of a lot of current manual labor, And that has a tremendous impact in terms of the fairness of distributors, just as that Ruff was saying at the very outset, that there will be the disruptional effects may be larger than we think. So we should, and that links back what Ruff said, think about a system of distributors' fairness. That's the global discussion. Now, if you try to break this now down, what's the problem actually? And I think I could come up with 4 dimensions of this discussion. The first dimension is digitalization of value chains. I mean, the examples that Felix just gave are the perfect examples. So supply chain management, digitize this from a paper-based world to a digital world. That requires data sharing. But the promises of big data go beyond that. They basically say there could be new novel services. And we funded a little project in the automotive sector that tried to say, if we shared more widely the data coming from the sensors that activate the windshield wiper, the sensor is built because the windshield has to be cleared. But that gives you information about humidity level at a specific geolocation if you geolocalize that piece of information. Now, with the fleets on our streets, that would give us a lot more data, weather data collection points than we have today with the rather coarse collection of weather data. So the question being, is there a secondary purpose of some data collected for something completely different that we could exploit in terms of the economic value? And how does that happen? How does this data be tradable? Is there a market for such data? Do we need to create data markets? Basically platforms where people can go say, hey, I'm Audi, I have a fleet of so and so many million cars out there. Now I can put you, with the consent of the driver, I can put all these data on sale through a marketplace. BMW is basically trying that out at the moment as we speak. So that's the second dimension. New things happening on data collected for something different originally. Repurposing of data in the age of big data. While we were reflecting on this, well, big data morphed into learning systems, so artificial intelligence of some sorts. So that's the new hype word, with maybe a specific type of setting where you say these algorithms need to be trained with something at least to go to the market in some sort of fashion, and then they will continue to learn as they're applied and in a commercial setting. So that's the third dimension of the discussion. So how do we foster an AI industry? Read the French Villani report on creating AI for humankind, I think is the title of the report. But if you have followed the debate, you haven't missed the Villani report. There's a whole chapter on data access, and the same goes for the UK. There's the Pesanti and Wendy Hall report. I mean, one factor in AI is obviously data access. So that's the third dimension. And the fourth dimension, which is a very complicated one, is what Rufus mentioned in the beginning, is monopolization tendencies. So are we seeing novel types of monopolies which were not imaginable to this scale in the past? And also people wrote about it in the popular literature. You find Viktor Meyer-Schönberger with a book on the market on reinventing capitalism, Das Digital in German. And again, the question, I mean, how do we distribute the value that data generates, and is there too much accumulation on them? So that's the four dimensions. We then had to apply a grid. Sorry for expanding a bit, but it's a long story, and then I'll get to my point, or the final point, in a second. So is there an actual legal problem? And we basically identified the IoT setting as a legal setting where it's not so clear who owns the data, if I can use that in a non-legal fashion. So if you have several stakeholders contributing to the data coming into existence, which is the IoT setting. In a consumer-facing situation, very simple. I drive my car, but the car is manufactured by AUDI. The supply parts come from somewhere else. And then there maybe even I'm renting a car as a rental company. I'm giving the car to someone. There's another person that contributes to the generation. So a couple of people need to come together for the data to be created in the first place. AUDI alone is not enough. The suppliers alone is not enough. I have to drive that bloody car to generate it. So who gets what from that cake, and who should have what kind of control rights over the usage? So the general data protection regulation gives you some, but if you are in a purely industrial setting, if you're now speaking to the KUKA robots, I mean, we don't really know. I mean, it's left to the contracts between AUDI and KUKA, and the two will say it's fine for us. But at least from a legal point of view, that was an interesting object to study. So we singled out, actually with a lot of help from the German academic side, and I see Andreas Wiebe is in the back of the room, and there was a whole discussion in academia whether these machine-generated data are the novel thing that we don't know quite what to do with it, and we will still have some questions. I'll terminate maybe with, well, basically contradicting of some sorts Rufus's initial statement with a study that Konrad Adenauer Stiftung procured from Karl-Heinz Fetzer. And while I disagree on the conclusion of Karl-Heinz Fetzer, who says, he makes the following line. He says, if data are really as important as we have to go to the basics of our societies, and the definition of private property brought the bourgeoisie into being. It emancipated the citizen, the bourgeois, from the aristocratic corners. Possession of something meant status because it got a legal validation. And if today data is the asset that we need to possess to change things, to live better, to have better health outcomes and God knows what, we need to emancipate each of us who are generators of data by a new ownership right. Now, there's enough reasons not to have that right because it has side effects in terms of leading to greater scarcity probably than we actually want for not having it. But the conceptual idea of Karl-Heinz Fetzer is important. We have to empower. We have to empower through data. And that's what we're trying now to do. So I will go into the details of the principles maybe in another round, but just to say why with them, or maybe simply saying, so there's two sets of principles, very important. Two sets of principles. One is basically saying, dear companies, if you contract on the use of IoT data, bear in mind that you're not doing them alone. You can't say, I'm exclusively owner of this data. Acknowledge that you're sharing this. And also acknowledge that IoT settings give a lot of more transparency, especially now speaking about the suppliers to AUDI, which is a very specific market, the car suppliers market, where a lot of people are under a lot of pressure from integrating operators. So, which is fine for some reasons. It's just the market happens like that. But now, if you can read things out of data that come along the supply of an object, because for quality management purpose you have to ensure that the supply process conform to all sorts of standards. But if you can exploit that data in a way that you read in also the economic efficiency of that supplier, that's something that is not desirable, and that will prevent the supplier from actually using interconnected systems, and that's bad for the rollout of IoT. So there's an industrial policy dimension in the discussion as well, where we have to be very careful, and companies like AUDI have to be very, very careful when they mandate handover of certain data in supply chains, that they're not asking too much, and that they're certainly not doing things that they shouldn't do, because it would be unethical, if you can say, that we try to overly exploit. And then we have a second type of discussion, which goes now, how should we datafy government? And would we need private sector data to help government to perform better? And that's a separate discussion we will have probably later. Yeah. But just to say that two sets of principles, and they try to address two different things.
Okay, and well, Jakob and Felix will get a chance later to say what they think of this set of principles that you have proposed. But before that, I would like to ask Peter, I mean, we have two companies here which are very large companies. There's also very different companies which might see some potential in data sharing, and which could develop some business models based on this. Maybe open our view a bit, make it a bit broader to this B2B data sharing issue. Okay. So is this on?
No.
Apparently not.
So that's fine. Oh, it's on now. I've moved. I won't move again. The wire is loose. So I think there's a thing here where we need to think about what the data is being used for. Mm-hmm. So what the purpose is. So at the ODI, we believe we want to create a world where data is more widely used by people, by communities, by organisations, by governments, to make better and more efficient decisions. That's what we're using data for. To get to that point, we have data which is held, which is collected, which is stewarded by organisations, whether that be AUDI or Deutsche Telekom. There's organisations who then are using that data to create services. At that point, going back actually to the previous panel, it's probably at that point where it's changing towards information. But they're using that data to create services which allow people to make decisions. Because again, unless we use data to make a decision, it really doesn't have much value. It's just bits and pieces we're carrying around, possibly like CryptoKitties on Ethereum, which may not have that much value if I was to think about it too hard. But that's what we're trying to get to. And those organisations who are creating services, often it's the organisation that's collected the data, often it's other people. Now, at the ODI, the way we look at this is, actually going back to Malte's, the kind of 4 problems, the way we look at it when we think of the ecosystem as a whole is, is the system left to itself going to create maximum social and economic value? Now, it's not just about the economic value, it's also social value we're creating from that data by making those decisions. And we see 2 forces really pulling us away from potentially creating that maximum value. So one is data hoarding. The people thinking, I need to keep the data to myself, whether that's me as an individual saying, I'm not going to fill in a census form, or I'm going to hold on to this because I want to profit myself with data about me, whether that's a business saying it wants to hold on to data, or a government looking to hoard the data and hold on to it. There's many reasons why they do that. Sometimes it's for the profit motive and selfish. Sometimes it's because they don't know anything different. It's just the way they've always worked. I think earlier today, Anya referred to closed by default, that where many organisations are, it's where we started. And we tend to counteract that. There's 3 ways we try to do that. One is, what Lee was talking about earlier on, about turning data into infrastructure, making it even more boring than data already is, making it so it's there when we need it, it's on tap, we can get to it and use it. Bringing in a culture of open innovation, so making that data infrastructure as open as possible and encouraging people to use that to create services. So whether that be Deutsche Telekom opening data and magically startups appear and start using it to create better services, who knows if that will happen. But targeting that activity, and also internally getting your own teams to say that data is more available, it's here, you can use it, and create that innovative atmosphere. The third bit, again, countering that data hoarding, is capability. Because part of what is happening around that data hoarding is there aren't that many people who know what can be done with the data. So the idea of the windscreen wiper, and the fact that all of these connected cars with their automatic windscreen wipers that flick on and off when the raindrops fall, that we can collect that. Not many people thought of that. There's a couple of experiments going on around it. I've not seen them take off at scale. But so creating that broader set of capability of more people with the skills and the literacy who can use the data or push back against hoarding. But there's another side as well, there's another threat, which is if we go too far in the other direction, we end up creating fear and loss of trust. Whether that be Facebook accidentally creating an API that Cambridge Analytica accidentally used to provide data accidentally to somebody else who used it for whatever they used it for, it's hard to tell. But that creates a backlash of fear. It's a backlash amongst individuals. Maybe I might start creating even faker data on Facebook about my life as a way of hiding from the manipulators. Maybe businesses start to withdraw sharing of data because they don't want to damage their business through those stories. Maybe governments start doing the same. So we end up with a wasteland as people get feared. And we tend to counter that with, I'll tackle this in a different direction than normal. One is by engagement, by talking with people about data, how it's being used, by having as broad a conversation as possible, across different groups of society, across different types of businesses. So people are engaged in that conversation and can say before something goes wrong, that is going to go wrong, I am not going to enjoy it. Through ethics, obviously data ethics is one of the topics of the year, but trying to work out the ethical issues, having greater ethical debates, at some points turning new bits of new ethical norms into legislation. Not everything, ethics and legislation are different things. Legislation's our baseline. Ethics is our debate around what should be in legislation or not quite often. But the third bit, which is very, very relevant to the B2B topic and the B2G, is equitable data, is equitable sharing of the benefits created by data. So we find some of that trust. If you look into that, the maelstrom around Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, or many of those other debates, when you look into it, it's actually people thinking they're benefiting more than me, whether that be a financial benefit, whether that's through decisions they can make because they have access to data other people don't have. It's about equity. It's about a fair share of the benefits. And that equity isn't just about sharing the financial benefits, like the compensation rights that Rufus talks about, but it's also sharing the services that are created. It's making sure there is fairness and there's a sense of fairness in the supply chains around the businesses, that people are saying, I do get a reasonable share of that benefits from that data that's being shared. I'm winning and everybody else is getting enough of a slice of the pie of what's going on. It's making us feel that when this data is shared and services are created, for example, actually a great place where governments have intervened in B2B data sharing would be open banking in the UK, in New Zealand, in Mexico, in Canada, in Japan, and Australia starting up as well now, is making sure that the services that are created as that data can flow more freely between companies, that it's happening for all socioeconomic groups. We're not just creating new services for the likes of me with a moderately shiny phone, which I've dropped a few weeks ago, but it's also happening for people who don't have access to smartphones. So we're creating that sharing of benefits. So we need to look at those, for us, we need to look at those different futures and try to say, how do we get to that future with the maximum social economic value? How do we intervene in quite a complex ecosystem? And through that process, create good sharing, which everyone trusts.
Thank you so much. Fairness is maybe a good keyword for you, Heiko, because obviously when you engage in this sort of data sharing between companies, there's always a question of competition and whether it's fair or not. Maybe you can talk about these issues which are at stake there in this context.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. There's so many issues there that are related to competition and fairness. I mean, what you basically mentioned is you share data, but the question is what and for which purposes, basically. And you have a platform, and you're somewhere in between, because if you share too much, especially if you share sensitive data, you might have competition problems then, right? Because at least I learned that information sharing is a bad term in competition law, basically, and so it has a negative connotation because it might lead to collusion. This is one thing, and collusion also not. Today we are talking about collusion of artificial intelligence and these things. So it is not bid rigging or price fixing in a conventional sense. So that is the one thing. The other thing is, are there competition problems, or can you frame it as a competition problem? Now, seeing it from the legislator, if you don't share, and this is a debate that we have when we were talking, you mentioned the word, or the panel before mentioned the word infrastructure, that it is an essential facility. And if you frame data as an essential facility, there might be grounds in competition law how you can access this data. I don't want to go deeper into discussion whether on which grounds and if that be good or not. There is a big discussion now in Germany to extend the German competition code and target some specific situations, especially also in the automotive industry, because this is a prime example where you have aftermarkets, where you want to create competition that you want to keep open for competition. But what I want to put emphasis on is that this came all from the access debate, and I'm very grateful that Malte revealed the history of the whole debate, because it was originally an ownership debate. But then also we had discussions, and it turned out actually it's about access to information. And if you say it is about giving sovereignty to the people and to the corporations or the actors, then you might create rights. Which rights are that? It could be access rights. But I'm pretty happy that it ended up as it ended up for now, which is first have a look at the contracts. This is, you have contractual freedom, you have technical mechanisms how you can make or secure data exchange and these things. We might think about contract first because the parties are the ones that know best what data they have and what data they might benefit from. So this is all related to competition, by the way, because you cannot see competition without contracts, because this is the core of the market economy, basically. And I find it quite interesting what you said, which is you describe different sorts of platforms, like one being a sharing, you called it a neutral platform, right? So where you actually you bring together different market participants and you stimulate them for sharing. And in other cases where you're part of a value creating network and you're within the supply chain, and there you exchange data for making processes more easy. What comes to my mind there, and there I'm building the bridge back to the competition issues, and maybe also with a nomenclature, because we already talked about whether it should be PSI or open data. I'm for PSI, but that has another reason. Sharing is also a very nicely framed term that comes from the sharing economy, basically, which might be a little misleading. It has a very benevolent connotation, but it is actually about, if I read it correctly, the Commission's guideline understand it in a very wide and broad sense. So it can also be against remuneration and the single spot transaction of data. This is sharing. So what we're actually talking about is the free flow of data, basically. So let data flow and people make use and benefits out of it. And this brings me to something I found quite interesting. If you see the sharing economy, so from the analog world, like Uber or Airbnb, if you see how it started, they started in the analog world, but now they transformed into data corporations. They are now data sharing platforms, basically, right? Because they're having all the data. And now the thing flips around. Now Airbnb is consulting cities, smart city environments, and so on. So what is there, and this is a competition issue I want to raise, is all that we learned about the platform economy and about the discussion about the platforms, how they can turn into monopolies. It might be something where we might have a closer look in a couple of years when it comes to data sharing. On these platforms, the data as such is shared. That is interesting. But the question is, if you have the platform, if you own the platform, and if data is shared on this platform, this might lead to new power constellations we have not ever thought about yet. That's all related to competition, I would say.
Thank you. So now, to wrap up this issue of B2B data sharing, maybe again, Jakob and Felix, you could talk about it from the practical point of view. Do you also see these competition issues? What do you think about these these suggestions that the Commission is making for transparent contracts, defining very closely what should be in them? What's your view from the practice side?
Well, I think now guidance is definitely a better choice than regulation, because we really have to remember, and thanks Malte for really again explaining where this all came from, and we as industry were part, we sat in numerous workshops organized by the Commission where we discussed all these issues over surely 2.5 years. And please correct me, but I would say there were probably 70-80% of industry representatives who said there is no market failure at the moment in our B2B cooperation. And we worship a principle, especially being a lawyer from Germany, the principle of contractual autonomy should first prevail unless there is indeed a market failure. And so far, I have to be frank, I have not really heard, and there were numerous studies and consultancies advising the Commission and whatnot. And in the end, I think the Commission took the step to say, we do not see enough for a regulation, especially a regulation that should basically tackle every sector. We hear always, and it's interesting because immediately when we talk about examples, it's like the fridge in IoT. The example is always the car, because it's so nice to talk about the Scheibenwischer, I always forget the English word, and all these different stakeholders coming together. But there are other sectors, and I would say the telecom sector is an example where actually this is working quite well, both in business to government, for the next debate, or business to business. And what we have been missing actually in the debate in Brussels was not, is it either guidance or regulation? What about competition law? And there we heard more and more coming from the Commission, look, competition law is too slow. So that's why we need to think of regulation. And we take the other way around and would say, well, look, if there's a market failure, if there's a dominance, then you have to speed up competition law and not have it too slow. If it's not practical anymore with the world that we're living in anymore, then you need to speed it up.
Okay.
But you cannot just solve it by basically introducing ex-ante regulation all the time.
Peter wants to quickly react to that.
Just one thing there on the market failure point and the need to intervene. So there's an interesting thing where sometimes we talk about, is there a market failure in access to data? So I know in the UK, actually, the independent review of AI said there was a market failure of access to data for AI startups. That was one market failure around data they identified. But sometimes in the sectors, there's different kinds of market failures that can be assisted by increasing access to data that can be tackled. So Payment Services Directive 2 in the EU was around allowing read-write access to data held by banks around payment services to tackle market failure in the payment service market and, in that case, create economic value in fintech. So similarly, open banking. So in the UK, that was around market failure of competition. In Mexico, it was market failure for financial inclusion services. So in those cases, the policymakers saw a market failure, but in fact, rather than saying the market failure in data, saw data as a tool that could help address the market failure. So then intervening on sectors to say, how do we increase access in that case, which I think is a really interesting, it's under discussed bit, which can still get the data flowing freely and help improve the market to give power to the consumers.
I think it's what I was trying to refer to look at both now relationships, B2B, B2G, is that with B2B, we read a bit and we hear a bit, well, in those contractual arrangements, there's always a weaker part and a stronger part, and in a way, the weaker part just, has to give up all the data. And I mean, I put this back over to you. What is the solution? And I think that has been extensively discussed, that the solution will probably not be to assign some kind of ownership like right to one entity, because this will also, in a way, lead to a very strong position. And on B2G, I read position papers from statistical offices that say we don't have enough data from the telcos. We need from every telco all the data, because we cannot exfoliate the data, which, by the way, we also do. So I think also statistical offices can do that. And we cooperate quite well with public entities, and we provide them analysis that we do on, passenger movements in an anonymized form and so on. So also there, I think the debate had been a lot, well, this is all in the public interest, open up your data, you don't do it enough. We really have to look at this, and I'm very glad that the Commission is actually looking at this now until the end of 2019. You have just set up a high-level expert group on private data sharing in the public interest. I hope we can be part of this. Many others, not only companies, but also, of course, I would say this academic world and others will be part of this to explore, is there really something we need to do or not? But that's why I would always say we have to really look into it in detail and just take and this is my last point, just take the connected car sector, and I don't want to talk too much on that, but I see it in Brussels since probably 2.5 years on every debate that is more or less has to do something with data. There will probably be some representative from the insurance sector, maybe somebody from the aftermarket who will stand up and say, we need access to the car. And the car maker will say, no, this is all solved already. You know this much better than I do, but I think we have to look at it at each sector. There cannot be a horizontal and harmonized approach how we somehow solve this whole issue, if there is an issue.
Thank you, Jakob. So we've kind of already now entered this discussion about data shared with governments and with the states. So, Felix, if you want to come back to the connected car.
Just
yes,
one statement,
please.
because I have to answer
Yes.
also to the statements from Peter,
Yes.
Malte, and Heiko, and that was a perfect bridge from my colleague from the Telekom, that I say we have to clarify maybe some basics, and then I want to explain maybe one concept where we are one step maybe before other sectors. So basically, we as a car manufacturer have committed ourselves to a transparent, economical, safe and secure handling of all kind of data. And that's absolutely necessary in order to be compliant with the relevant legislation like GDPR. But concurrently, we support also a course of fair and non-discriminated and secure exchange of data. So, for example, what we discussed to announce vote safety to all vote users, to create new businesses and innovation for our customers, and also to stimulate innovation for general. But data exchange should not only be improve transport and services and user experience, it should also be secure and safe, and it should allow innovators to monetize their investments. So, convinced on that, we think from our perspective we do not need additional legal regulation. We think we can achieve these goals, and we developed the last 2 years, I think, in hard discussion and a lot of workshops, also in close cooperation with, for example, our suppliers or also the service market, the so-called Nevada concept. So the Nevada concept stands for Neutral Extended Vehicle for Advanced Car Access, and it means that you have neutral server, so there are a lot of platforms like Autonomo, Caruso, Nexus Texas, and so on. So there are a lot, and from our point of view, this is really a role model for a sector-specific solution. So that means with Nevada, we are the first industry sector presenting a solid and mostly widely accepted approach and to share car data. And I think that could be a blueprint for other sectors as well. And that's not a regulation, it's more than a good opportunity to follow up that. And last statement, to own data and who is the owner of data, we completely closed this discussion. We don't talk, when we in the company talk about it, we don't talk about own data, we discuss and describe it as licensing data. Who has the access? So, and that's completely the same what the guys here talk about.
Thank you. So since we're running a little bit out of time, but we really need to talk about this B2G issue. So Malte, if you could lay out, we've already heard from the telecoms side what the possible problems are there. What is the Commission proposing, and what do you see happen after 2 years?
No, with pleasure. And I think it bridges also to tomorrow morning's 8 o'clock discussion for those who are the early birds. So it's about data-driven government. I mean, it's about data. Government collects a lot of data itself. That's sure and certain. And we had it bit discussed before. We're also inflicting reporting obligations. I mean, the gender pay gap information is a reporting obligation you inflict on the company. Say, fill in the survey every year to report us and this and that. And that a lot of these reporting obligations exist in all countries and also come from European level. So it's one way of data gathering, to inflict a survey on companies to pursue a certain policy objective and obtain the data. But obviously, I mean, the government also likes to use big data resources, I mean, to leverage the power of basically finding insights from data that may not be at the same methodological quality as the good old statistics, but that could be getting quite close. And the telecom example is one of the example. If you want to know the real population in a country in real time, the people carrying phones give you a fair good impression of that. And you, as Jakob rightly said, you don't need to know all the phones in the country. If you have 3 to 4 providers, which is normally what any country has, you can go to one and then find out what segments of the populations they're more popular in, and then you can, statisticians will then model you something that gives you the insights that you need. And basically what we're trying, it ran a bit under the cover of this data ownership and access discussion, and it was because our Director General is very much attached to also make government more data driven, and he was saying we should have a better lever in that. And again, good news is there is models out there, and the French did it, and the British government did it, at least for the benefit of the statistical offices to say, well, we've surveyed you enough in the past, maybe we can change the model. And if you're Tesco, we don't have to, we can maybe get the aggregated value of shopping baskets of UK citizens. And that's a way to know inflation of household consumer prices. And that's a very simple example to say, well, if you knew what UK citizens buy at Tesco, that gives you, and then you know, I mean, what strata of the population buy at Tesco, you get a fair good view on how prices run. Now, there were some papers, I think Jakob was hinting at that, by the statistical offices that said, well, we want all that data and we want it for free. Now, the colleagues, at least that we speak to in the European umbrella organization Eurostat, they say, evidently we need to speak to the people who have the data. We need to understand the data model. So there's no way to come with a gun and say, give me all that data and I carry it home and try to do some magic. That's not the way it works, obviously. But you have to understand the way they were collected, the quality that you have. You have to sit down with people, and that basically gives you the situation where you would sign a contract. Now, we've been hearing about the non-rivalrous nature of data now throughout the session. The question is, if the statistical officers come to a company like Deutsche Telekom or to Tesco and say, give me all that data, is the data gone from Tesco systems? No, it isn't. Is it gone from Deutsche Telekom systems? No, it isn't. I mean, Deutsche Telekom will still find ways to monetize on that data. So that suggests that Eurostat will not pay the full price for the data coming to existence, but some sort of market-based price. And with the principles, we try to say one additional thing on top of the market price, which is the critical bit when we speak about preferential conditions. It says if we're speaking about really a very pressing social need, so disaster recovery after an earthquake or fighting epidemics, that's the popular examples, maybe there is also a good reason to say, well, we should somewhere find ourselves below market price. But that's suggestions that we put now in the principles to say that an expert group should look at that and then basically come up with a sensible framework, because we know that it has to be sustainable for the data providers. The data generation should not stop, and it should be sustainable over time.
So there will be a framework after the...
Well, the group will hopefully recommend something to do, or to do nothing. Could also be happen that the framework could be contracts go on.
No, I mean, just to, if I may respond.
Yes. But then we really need to please respond
very quick.
And really quickly, and then we can open the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the impression is there that we do not, or we don't want to work with public entities. It's really the contrast. I mean, it's not only statistical offices. The whole smart city that we're seeing, we're working with cities, with communities. But you have to, when you talk about market price, you have to also see that, you know, each teleco is different, and also in other sectors, each player can maybe provide something different. We're not all the same. Maybe we provide a little bit more quality than maybe a competitor. And this quality, we don't do for nothing. If the company in the end is just a public commodity because it's all in the public interest, then I wonder, why are we always talking only about the telecommunications and maybe not others, not to name any, but I mean, in all the ad economy, we have lots of other players that can also provide valuable information, but we don't hear discussion about that. I only hear the energy, the telecom sector, and so on. So indeed, there are a lot of questions to be tackled, and I think this working group will definitely be beneficial.
Luckily, we don't have to tackle them all tonight, which is why I would like to open the floor to any questions from the audience.
I'm Christian Horn. I'm the head of the office of the German Open Data Portal. And in the last half year or so, I start thinking about opening the portal for public or for business data like Telekom or AUDI or any other business. It's my private opinion. We have to open it, and I want to start the discussion in the German administration. And I want to know from you, from the business, from the Telekom, and from AUDI. Do you think that your companies would publish data in such a portal, in a public administration driven portal? Or do you think you will, if you publish data, you will publish it only on your own website?
Since in the beginning I mentioned this data intelligence hub that we have just created, you could say this is a little bit the competition, because there we also hope to get publicly available data and public entities to be on that marketplace together with private actors. And for the moment, our subsidiary Motion Logic, for example, which does all this traffic and location data analysis for the statistical offices, is going to offer that on that platform. I'm the wrong person to ask to, but I think we have an interest in sharing our data. Surely, but we need to respect, in a way, with all the discussion about data should be open, and this is very understandable, but you also have to respect there always needs to be, in a way, also a commercial interest. And the analysis and the aggregation and all of that, to my understanding, is done by us and not necessarily by a public entity. And for that, in a way, we need to be compensated, which doesn't mean that, you know, a data portal like this cannot work. But again, we have some competition building up.
Yeah, and just a small statement also from my side. I completely see that in the same case. So, as I explained with Nevada and Neutra Server, we completely and of course support a fair and non-discriminatory exchange of data. So from this side, it's absolutely possible, and we understand and support that, to give data in this kind of nurture server. And as we discussed at the beginning, we have to really focus on every type of data, of every use cases. So the insurances are completely different to support and after sales. And what we do at Nevada, and I think it was also in the discussion before, we categorize data. So we start with data in the category A, who is responsible and important for every kind of customer and user, road user. So in that part we don't discuss, we want to share that, not for nothing, so for a special kind of value, we don't know. But and then we have the importance category about signals and maybe personalized data. There we have really focused if we can share that because of technical and also legal recommendation.
A quick reaction from Peter, and then we have a question up there.
It's a good question. Thanks, Christian. I think there's so what we've found. So we've been talking about this with some businesses, who are publishing fully open data as well as shared data, more sensitive data. They've got commercial models around. When the data is fully open, so for example in the UK, there's data from banks about bank branch locations and access for banks, or the products that they sell as well. That's open data. Or from the physical activity sector, so the opportunities to use a gym class, in the UK, people are publishing that as open data. They're doing that as open data because they want it to be as widely available as possible, so they get more customers. So that's why the commercial proposition is, because people see the data and then can drive to go to their services. So in those cases, when they're publishing that like that, and they're publishing it decentralized, if the public sector wanted to pick it up and put it on their portal, the business doesn't care because they're still getting the value they want. So I can imagine in an AUDI or a Deutsche Telekom sense of, for AUDI, the makes of car. the price tags of those cars, the colours that are available, all of those things could be open data. And if you want a copy, it's open data, take it. Or for Deutsche Telekom, the location of masts for mobiles, because that helps people know, do I have coverage near my house? Therefore, should I sign up for a contract? That's going to be useful. Or the products that the telecoms operators own. So some of those things I think could be open, and if that's the case, if it's fully open, then if the public sector wanted to pick it up and put it on the portals they run, that'd be good fun.
Okay, thank you.
And that creates that decentralized marketplace with a free flow of data.
Sorry, I think it would be much easier to find that kind of data if you publish it on a central portal. It mustn't. We don't need our portal. It could be another portal, but I think we need central point of finding data and not so many different. And for example, the portal with the car data, I never heard about it. So I think it's very it would be a good idea to share it on a central portal.
I think the data discovery is fascinating. The users enter all over the place, and there's now Google now supports search for data, which is fantastic. So I think having the data in many portals. So it might be that it might be that there's a portal all the way across Europe of car colours, and the different car colours in countries, because there's a community of people who love car colour data. That's one portal. There might be, it will exist, those people will be there, not that many, but there will be some. There might be some people who are, I'm interested in Germany, in transport data in Germany, so a national access portal for transport data, which is one of the EU directives to create that, or the European data portal to say, here's everything that's emerged now because of initiatives like the PSI. So I think those thousands of portals is great. That's kind of the web logic, and then we can discover them in different ways.
Okay,
And Simon Chignara has tested Google data search, and is he in the room? I've never met Simon. No, he's there. We met actually, but didn't see you. So he will be probably tomorrow report on the testing experience. But the question is essentially,
So
what's the function of a portal? What's the discovery function of a data portal? And does it matter whether it's all in one place or it's distributed? I mean, that's a discussion in itself, and maybe Simon can also in the
move
break
on
come to that.
tomorrow, and for those of you who are not here tomorrow, maybe to the reception after this. Gentleman up there has the last question, and then we will wrap it up.
Andreas Wiebe, University of Göttingen. I would like to come back to Mr. Schwabe. You talked about data sharing, and I would like to have two questions. One, could you please be a bit more specific what it means, data sharing? And I think partly you answered it already. Do you charge money for the data you put on the platform? Is it like a reciprocity? You put data, the other companies put data? First question. Second question, what happens if the data you put on the platform will go beyond to third parties, which are not bound by contracts or by the platform conditions? Would it be a problem from your point of view if people who are not contractually bound would have access and use the data that you're producing?
Yeah, let me explain that with a kind of use case. When we think about, for example, a service technique online, so we call it that we can control and can get information from our car. So is the tire broken or something else? And we can give this information to our service stations, and you as a customer get an offer, hey, you are in the near of my garage, you get a good offer and appointment to change this part. So, and now that's one-on-one business, what we do. And now comes, for example, RTU, German garage, or other offers, and say, we want this data also, because you do our business. And that's the reason, because we have this hard discussion with the Klepper and ASEA and so on, because we need this neutral server. And for example, what I explain is Caruso. Caruso is a kind of neutral server who is really focused on after-sales solution. So, and when I give the information, for example, for car maintenance to one-on-one, then I have to give the same data to this neutral server. And what we discussed, not for nothing. So we have a lot of cost. For example, we discussed about 80 or 90 million to get the data out of our cars. So we call it about car data technology. It's a huge investment for us as a car manufacturer. And we don't know the value at the moment, so we have to explain that and also work with this neutral server. But then we gave also the responsibility, the consent management, and so on to this third party. And that makes also for us the business easier. And that's also the reason to the guy in this direction. Yes, we completely support and understand it, and support also the change and the exchange of our data to neutral server.
Okay. I think whatever questions we may have left, we can easily talk over at the reception. Thank you so much for staying this late at a panel talk and being such an engaged panel over here. And I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion tomorrow.
Thank you.
Just a second. If I may ask Walter, if you could sum up with one sentence, what's your thoughts after the whole evening? And the same question to Lina.
Short, I want to quote the mapping. So we need mappers for the utopia, which we had here, because I'm sure we'll stay with the topic as data and also inequality. And we start tomorrow at 8, and at 12:30 we have then like the PSI lunch thingy for those who are interested in the policy stuff. So there's the invitation for mapping that stuff. And thank you so much.
I think as for the B2B part, I think we've sort of discussed that the way the Commission has approached this is quite okay, and we will see in the future what else is needed. As for the B2G part, there's value in data-driven government that I think everybody can see, and we will have to wait a few more years until we see a framework.
Okay, so also my thoughts, if I may say a couple of words. I think hopefully we'll have less market failure when it comes to PSI in Europe, thanks to this directive. And finally, we talk about data infrastructure in Europe and harmonizing some issues. And when it comes to B2B world and B2G, I think we agreed that the competition law is the right tool for the moment. And it's up to the dominant data holder to prove this in the next years. The Konrad Adenauer Foundation is going to follow the issue in the next months and years. This was the first European Data Summit in Berlin. Maybe the next will be elsewhere. Many thanks for the beautiful discussion, and I'm inviting you for a glass of wine after this session and to continue this the talk till 10:30, I think, or till 11 in our academy. Many thanks. And the last remark, if some of you is early bird, as Malte said, and you really, really want to wake up at 8 o'clock and take part in the discussion with the title Data-Driven Government, talk to me and we'll find a place for you. Many thanks.